Dear Father in heaven, we invite your Spirit's presence as we open your word together. Thank you so much for the light that is shining upon our path. Give us the strength to walk in it, that we may make it all the way to the city. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So this is the third study. We've been studying the book of Ezra, specifically the chronology of the book of Ezra. And I had asked you to do some assignments, and your notes, the pages aren't quite right. They didn't get printed out correctly, so things aren't lined up the way they should be. But on page 16, there were these questions and assignments. And one of the assignments that I've been getting people to do is to use the Torah calendar. And the Torah calendar is a website that gives you, allows you to look at the first visible crescent in Jerusalem on any year, going back, I think it doesn't go even to 4000 BC, it only goes to 3990 something, 92 or something like that. I'm not sure why they don't go all the way further back, but they don't with that program. There's also Formulab's calendar converter, which uses the Julian day numbers if you don't like counting manually on a calendar to count the dates. And in the first lesson, of course, we have the rules of the biblical calendar, how to calculate the dates on it. Now, I'm having you do this for a number of reasons. One, so you can verify the things that I'm saying are correct, especially when we get to Millerite history. The other thing is that when you do these things, figure out dates on your own, it helps give you a connection with what we're doing. So I may, write a date up there and you say, okay, he wrote this date, it looks interesting, but you don't fully understand it. If you understand it, you're much more likely to remember it, and especially if you've worked it out on your own. So a lot of these things I've worked out on my own different times, and sometimes I've come up with slightly different answers as I've learned more. And that's the other thing, is I would like people to check my work so that I know that I'm not making mistakes. If other people understand how to do it, they can check it. There are a few people around the world who, when I do presentations, they send me emails with corrections of things that I did wrong, or that they think I did wrong. Now, they're not always correct that I was wrong, if that makes sense. So, it's important to do the assignments for your own benefit. And there was one question that I asked, which was question number 5 on page 16. Is the idea that the Second Temple was complete 59 years prior to Artaxerxes' decree new to you? And I know it's not new to you, but it's something that was new to me a few years ago, and I ask people that question all the time, and to most people it's new to, unless they've seen one of my presentations. It's new to them until they hear it from me, usually. So, but some people are very skeptical about that, even after I presented it, because it goes so much contrary to things that they've heard. I've taught it, that the temple was built after Artaxerxes' decree, not 59 years before. So these are things that we need to check out for ourselves. Now, in this third study, we're dealing with Artaxerxes' decree specifically, and I have this whole section written in my notes, which I'm not going to go through in detail, but when it comes to the start of the 2300 days, could each of you, who here could prove that the Artaxerxes' decree was in 457 BC? That is, that the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem, which we're going to study, how many people think that they could prove it to other people? Do you know how to do that? That it's 457 BC. Now, I think most of us would know that that's what we teach as Seventh-day Adventists, and we know it's true, but we don't know why it's true, because if we can't show it to somebody else, we can't prove it, why do we believe it? You know, that's the question I have. And the question is a good one for Seventh-day Adventists, because many Seventh-day Adventists no longer believe it. They've abandoned the 70 weeks and the 2300 days because many of our scholars have abandoned those dates. And so the foundation and central pillar of Adventism, which is the sanctuary in connection with the 2300 days, many Adventists no longer believe. And you will see in some Adventist literature, especially older literature, this idea that it's a proven date, but beyond all doubt, it's like one of these established dates that Artaxerxes' 7th year was in 457, when in reality, the only ones who take that position are Seventh-day Adventists, and a few people who unwittingly have followed what Seventh-day Adventists have said. So they might have read on a website somewhere it was 457 BC, and they just accept it because they read it somewhere and it happened to be an Adventist website, because we're the most represented church on the internet. And the main argument is on page 18 of your notes, and this argument is from the book of Nehemiah, and this is basically the only biblical argument that scholars have for 457 BC. So in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, we're going to read that verse. So of course Nehemiah used to be part of the book of Ezra, but is no longer. It was made a separate book later on. So it's just right after Ezra. Now the book of Nehemiah starts with this. It says, "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Halachiah, and it came to pass in the month Kislev, or Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace." So this Kislev is the 9th month of the Jewish year, and the Jewish months are counted from the spring, so the 9th month is in the winter time, and it's in the rainy season. And in the 20th year, it says, now it doesn't say that it's the 20th year of Artaxerxes. So that's one of the things that people who are opposed to 457 BC, and I'll try to explain this in a minute here, but this is the 20th year, it says, but it doesn't say the 20th year of Artaxerxes. Now, in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "It came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before me, and I took up the wine." So this is later. Chapter 2 comes after chapter 1 chronologically. So what is it telling us when it says that this is the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, and it's the month of Nisan? What would that tell us, or what do you think scholars are trying to gain from this knowledge?
At the very least, it would be the next year.
Okay, so on the Jewish calendar, the months are counted from the spring. So Nisan's always the first month, even if the year starts in the fall. So Artaxerxes counted his reign spring to spring. So when you get to the month Nisan, what if Artaxerxes is counting his reign, and the 20th year of his reign in the 9th month comes before the month of Nisan, when you get to the month of Nisan, what year of his reign would it be? If if Artaxerxes was counting the years of his reign. So what should it say if it's the way that Artaxerxes counted his year, spring to spring? So the 21st year, it should say, right? If it's spring to spring. So the argument that Adventist scholars make is that the first verse is in the 20th year, but it's in the 9th month. And then when we get to Nisan, which is now at the beginning of the year, it's still the 20th year. They're arguing that Ezra is counting the years of the reign out of Artaxerxes fall to fall.
Well, it does say of Artaxerxes, doesn't it?
In chapter 2, but not in chapter 1. Right? So there's, I agree with the argument. I agree that that's the way Ezra's counting it. At least that's the way it appears that he's counting it. Now, why would Nehemiah, or Ezra really, who wrote Nehemiah, why would he count the years of the reign of Artaxerxes fall to fall? What do you think the reasons are he would do that? If Artaxerxes counts them spring to spring, why would Ezra count them fall to fall?
Isn't that how the Jews did it? The civil?
Okay, so the question is, the answer is, the Jews did it that way. Did they do it that way? Do we have evidence they did it that way?
I thought they did it with the kings and the civil stuff.
Okay, so we hear, that the Jews counted the years of the reign of their kings fall to fall. But did they also count them spring to spring? Sometimes. Most of the times, the kings of Judah counted spring to spring, and the kings of northern Israel counted fall to fall. And we know that Josiah, at least, we can show that he counted his reign fall to fall, and that all the way up to Jehoiakim, it was counted fall to fall. But that Zedekiah counted his reign spring to spring. So, for them to count this reign fall to fall seems kind of odd. Why wouldn't you just count it the way the king counts it? So we don't know what the reason is. Yes, Stephen?
How do you know that which king that count fall to fall and which king count to spring to spring?
Well, it's a difficult question. Yeah, there is some of the kings we can't tell. So some of them we have to assume. But there are, we know that Zedekiah had to have counted it spring to spring. And we know Josiah counted it fall to fall. And that Jehoiachin counted it fall to fall. So most likely so Jehoiakim probably did. He's in between there. And there's a number of ways. One, all these different spans and these different dates. So it's rather complicated. But we would know that definitely Solomon counted spring to spring. We can tell when he built the temple and the dates that are given for how long it took him to build the temple and to build his house, and these various dates, we can figure it out. You have a comment there, James?
I was going to ask if we knew what the average was between Saul and Josiah, if it was spring or fall.
Between Saul and all the way, well, I'm not sure where the change happened, but the change would have happened. So it would have been spring to spring all the way, at least up to Jotham, so Ahaz's father. And we don't know if it changed with Ahaz or Hezekiah or Ammon or Manasseh.
It changed.
Or what's that?
But it changed.
It changed in there somewhere before Josiah. Yes, Andrea.
I may have missed it, but why did some of the kings do fall to fall and others spring to spring? Why wasn't there just a one way of calculating?
Well, we don't know for sure, but we do know that God gave them a calendar that was spring to spring, and that Saul, David, Solomon, they would have counted their years of their reign spring to spring. That would make the most sense, since that's the way their calendar worked. Northern Israel chose to count their reigns fall to fall, probably in rebellion to be different, because Jeroboam set up a false system of worship on the 15th day of the 8th month, and that's where that prophecy of Josiah occurs, when he's offering on the altar there. And so he probably began the years of his reign in the fall. And so the kings of northern Israel continued that practice all the way through until Hoshea, the last king. So the theory is that either Ahaz, in his rebellion, chose to start counting the years of his reign fall to fall, or maybe one of his sons. But by Josiah, they were still counting it fall to fall. And there may be some evidence that there was two different ways of counting Hezekiah's reign, which I'm not going to go into. But if we were dealing with 723 and looking at that, there's some discrepancies that can be explained by two different ways of counting Hezekiah's reign, so that it's sometimes counted fall to fall and sometimes spring to spring. But that's a whole other area. But we don't really know the reason, other than it's speculation. They haven't told us. But we figure that out. So in this history, in 457, we have this is the only argument that we have from the Bible, is that in Nehemiah, it appears as if they're counting the king Artaxerxes, his reign fall to fall. And I think it's a sound argument, but it's the only biblical argument that our scholars have. Now, what I'm going to present is some other arguments that are not normal scholarly arguments, and they're based upon the structure that occurs in this story, and that we can connect the events of 457 to the events of 1844. And this to me is it's a more convincing argument for me personally than some of these scholarly arguments. Now, they do have other arguments that are outside the Bible, and they use things called the Elephantine Papyri. These are documents, contracts mostly, that come from Egypt, an island in Egypt called Elephantine. And there was a colony of Jews during the time of Artaxerxes, and these things are dated, and there's 2 letters or documents that are dated that appear to be showing a fall-to-fall reckoning of Artaxerxes' reign. And these are very technical arguments, and they're highly disputed among scholars. So for the average person out there, God has not meant that we have to become experts in Egyptian archaeology to understand 457 BC, or that we have to trust some experts that we have no idea what they're doing in regard to this. And also for many Seventh-day Adventists, that's all we have is basically the arguments of scholarship of our pastors, of the Biblical Research Institute. And if they decided, our whole basis was wrong, as a Seventh-day Adventist, we wouldn't really have much to stand on. We would have to say, well, maybe they're right. So I think there's arguments here in the story of Ezra that really help us understand that God has guided us in establishing 457 BC, and the chances that we are wrong are really zero. That Adventism was founded on a correct methodology. So there's a few pages, and I'm not going to go through it. It would take a long time to go through these pages, but I put them there for your benefit to read. So it's the beginning of that. So a whole bunch of technical arguments there. Criticisms of Adventist methods on page 20, page 21, the end of the 2300 days. And so this is sort of where we're going to where we're going to go to is we're going to go to page 22, Daniel 9, verse 25. So a lot of that other stuff, I want you to read it, but we're not going to go over to it. I might refer to some of the ideas there. There's some things I want to refer to that I'm just skipping in the notes. So if you remember, how many decrees, or which of the 3 decrees starts the 2300 days? You got Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. So you have these 3 decrees. 536 in the spring. We learned that this was probably on the 24th day of the first month. And then we have Darius's decree in 516, sometime in the summer. We don't know the exact date of the decree. And then we have Artaxerxes' decree. And this we're saying is in 457. So which of these decrees starts the 2300 days? Which of these decrees do we need? And which don't we need? Maybe that's another question. Okay, we need all 3 decrees. Ellen White says in The Great Controversy, Cyrus's decree in originating, Darius's in affirming, and Artaxerxes in completing the specifications of the prophecy. So that means all 3 decrees are needed in establishing the specifications of the prophecy. And if you look up Artaxerxes, Darius, and Cyrus in your E.G. White search, you'll find the quote in The Great Controversy. I can't remember the page offhand. But this is in the book great controversy, and there's references to it in Prophets and Kings as well. So one, we see it's a three-step process. There's 3 decrees, the first, the second, and the third, and we know that this is a reform line with the period of darkness, and we're not going to look at the reform line. And we know that in this history we have Xerxes and the story of Esther, which deals with a Sunday law. And as we're starting to understand the reform lines better, I still have not really sorted out how I want to understand this reform line, how I want to understand like the arrival and the formalization and the empowerments of each of the messages. And I haven't really decided how to address the story of Esther, how I fit that in with the reform line. Is it just another story within this reform line, or is it part of the reform line? So I'm not going to address those things right now. But what we do know is that there's this 3-step process. Now in Daniel 9, so let's turn there, Daniel 9 verse 25. Can somebody read the verse for us? With a nice resonating voice.
Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times.
Okay, so when we read this verse, how do we normally read it? What starts, what does the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, what does that refer to? Okay. Okay, so 457, Ezra leaving Babylon. Typically as a Seventh-day Adventist, how would we read this statement? What starts the 70 weeks? If we were just going to use this verse, what would we say? Okay, but not 457. What is the event that starts the 70 weeks?
The restoration.
Typically for a Seventh-day Adventist, we would say the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right? So we take this statement as referring to one event. There's some point where there's this going forth of this commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. That's how we read it. Now, William Miller, when he first looked at this verse, he understood that the going forth was when. When did he believe the going forth of the commandment was?
Spring.
The spring of 457 BC. And what was the going forth of the commandment about? What's that?
I'm asking you to ask your question differently.
Okay. Why does he place the going forth of the commandment in the spring? What is the going forth of the commandment to him, to Miller? What event is he using to mark that?
Ezra receiving the decree by Artaxerxes.
Okay, so Ezra receiving the decree, did he receive the decree in the spring of 457?
I think that's an assumption that we make.
It's an assumption. Now, I would say that as a Seventh-day Adventist, I was extremely confused upon this point for years. And one of the reasons is that I got different answers in different books. So some people would talk about that the decree went into effect in the fall, which is what Ellen White says, but many people would say that the decree was issued in the fall. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that. So people would just think the decree was issued in the fall because it's 457 and they just believe it starts in 457, so the decree must be issued in the fall. And that was sort of the view I held for a long time. And it was really confusing trying to get Artaxerxes' 7th year to fit in any way. Now, let's turn to Ezra chapter 7. Now, does it say that Artaxerxes issued the decree in his 7th year? Right? This is the other thing, is often we believe that it was issued in his 7th year. Doesn't say that. So in Ezra chapter 7, we're going to start reading here. It says, "Now after these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, the son of Sariah, the son of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, the son of Shulem, the son of Zadok," a lot of different genealogy here. And he says in verse 6, "This Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a ready scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given, and which given. And the king granted him all his request, according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him. And there went up some of the children of Israel, and of the priests, and of the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the Nethinims, unto Jerusalem, in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king." So these people went up in the 7th year. It doesn't say the decree was issued in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. But we could assume maybe that it was, but this is something that's not explicitly stated in the text. And then it says, "He came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. For upon the 1st day of the 1st month began he to go up from Babylon and on the 1st day of the 5th month came he to Jerusalem, according to the good hand of his God upon him." So, when did he leave Babylon?
On the first day of
Yeah.
the first month.
Yeah. So we're going to have this here. So on the 1st day of the 1st month, he leaves Babylon. And this is when Miller marks the going forth of the commandment, because he's leaving Babylon with the commandment in his hand. Now, Miller had made a mistake, because Miller says, from the going forth of the commandment in 457 BC to the death of Christ on the cross in 33 AD is exactly 490 years to the day. Okay, now, is that true? Okay, why is it not true?
Doesn't match up to the 70 weeks to baptism.
Okay, why is it not true? You have to say it louder.
It doesn't match up to the 70 weeks
Okay, how does it not match up?
because the 70 week would get you to 27 AD, and then
For the baptism.
and then in the middle of the weeks when you die is the 31.
Right. So Miller didn't understand that Jesus died in the midst of the week. He had Jesus being crucified at the end of the 70 weeks. So in 33 AD. And then also from 33 AD to 457, he just did simple math. 457 plus 33 equals 490. But how long would it actually be?
489.
Yeah, so 489 years. So later on, they came to understand that they had made this mistake. And contrary to popular belief, they understood this back in at least 1842, that they're discussing the fact that there is no 0 year. Now, they don't use it that way. They just talk about that there's a full year between 1 BC and 1 AD. And that's basically, so they're saying from any point in 1 AD or 1 BC, so if you started on January 1st, 1 BC, and you go to a full year, it'll bring you to January 1st, 1 AD. That means there's no 0 in there. And so they came to understand that. Now, why did the Millerites then not just change the 2300 days to end in 1844? Why didn't they just say, oh, we were wrong, we forgot about the 0, let's change that it's somewhere in the year 1844 Christ is going to return, when they discovered there was no 0 year? Why did they not do that? So they discovered this late in 42 or even in 43. When did they make this chart?
42.
So May of 42. So they had on a chart that said 1843. So one is, what would they have to do with this chart? Yeah, they'd have to correct it somehow. They could have. what else is a problem in just changing the date to 1844? What other problem do they run into? What would you have to do with the cross, with Jesus' death? If you were going to change, just simply change it to 1844, what would you have to do with the crucifixion? You'd have to move it to 34 AD. And there was no support for that idea anywhere. Nobody had Jesus crucified in 34 AD. And so this was a problem. Now, what they did is they then said, well, Jesus was just crucified within the last year, the 490th year. Now, and that worked with their ideas of the 2300 days, because they didn't have the 2300 days have to completely end, that Jesus could come back any time within that 2300th year. Does that make sense? So that then could fit. But as they started to establish when in the year that he could come, they came to the extremity of that, and the extremity was that Jesus could come back sometime in that Jewish year 1843, which would end in the spring of 1844, and it would only go as far as the last day of the Jewish year 1843. Does that make sense to everyone? That, I mean, we should know this, but we know that the 2300 days are going to end at the very end of the Jewish year 1843. That's the way the Millerites came to understand it. So it was odd to have the 70 weeks just end at the beginning of the 490th year, not at the end of it. Does that make sense? So there's just this, it's not very accurate. It becomes this problem as they're trying to sort this out. Now, if this is the going forth, when we look at this, we could look at this verse a little bit differently. So we're going to say that this is the going forth of the commandment. So if this is the going forth of the commandment, when do they return to Jerusalem? According to the verse we read. So the first day of the 5th month. And if we read the verse in Daniel 9, it says the going forth of the commandment to restore. Now, some of you know about this, but if you look up the Hebrew word that's translated restore, it means return. And that's because the word restore, when the King James was translated, meant return. And it's like the word repair. So these words, restore and repair, we usually think of them as to fix things up. But they originally meant to return to something or return something to somebody. So when you take something from somebody and then you give it back to them, you're restoring it. If you and the word repair, which, you know, just an example of this is people used to say, I'm going to repair to my room. That means I'm going to return to my room. So words change their meanings over time. So the King James translators translated it correctly. But that word is often translated in the King James as turn. It's the word shuv in Hebrew, and return. So one translation that predates the King James, the Bishop's Bible, says from the going forth of the commandment and the return of the people to Jerusalem to build, right? Or to return and to build Jerusalem. So it says the return of the people. So is the first day of the 5th month the return of the people? Because if the going forth is the first day of the 5th month, first day of the 1st month, is the first day of the 5th month the return? Are they returning, right? So we could just say that this verse is not talking just about the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, but it's the going forth of the commandment on the first day of the 1st month, and to return is referring to the first day of the 5th month. So what step do we have left in the verse? The going forth of the commandment, to restore or to return, and to build. Okay, does everybody see this? Now, do we have a date that we can use to mark the to build? Okay, so somebody's saying the 10th day of the 7th month. How would we know that we're going to mark the 10th day of the 7th month with the to build? You know, a typical Adventist, when we start the 2300 days, do we start it on the 10th day of the 7th month?
When we start it?
The 2300 days and the 70 weeks, do we start them on the 10th day of the 7th month? For the average Seventh-day Adventist?
No.
No, we just start them in the year 457 BC.
457.
And why do we end the 2300 days on the 10th day of the 7th month? If we don't have a specific point to start it, why do we end it on the Day of Atonement?
We use the Day of Atonement.
We use the Day of Atonement because
As a typical Adventist.
yeah, we use the Day of
We use
Atonement
the Day of Atonement.
because it's fall types.
Yeah.
Right? So we don't have any specific starting point for the 2300 days. And that's a problem, really, when you think about it, because if we were to, to really look at this in detail, we would see that nothing happens in 457 BC on the 10th day of the 7th month, and we're not really anchored back to 457 BC by any events. Now, we're going to look at how we connect this history with 1844. So let's turn to Ezra 7, verse 24. No, let's not even go there yet. Let's go to chapter 8. So we know he left on the first day of the first month, and he arrives in Jerusalem on the first day of the first month, and he arrives in Jerusalem on the first day of the 5th month. And in chapter 8, it gives us some more details regarding this journey. It starts out with listing all these different people who are traveling, and then it says in verse 15, "And I gathered them together to the river that runneth to Ahava, and there we abode in tents 3 days, and I viewed the people and the priests, and found there were none of the sons of Levi." So when he gets out of Babylon, he travels a little ways, and he gets to the river Ahava, and they camp there for 3 days. When he gets there, what does he find? There's no Levites, right? He has some priests, but no Levites, no sons of Levi. And then he sends some people to go back to Babylon to get some of them, and he appoints different people to do some of this. And then in verse 21 he says, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right way for us, and for our little ones, and for all our substance." And so again, it talks about this fast. So this is just repeated and enlarged. First time he says, I got there, we had a fast, we were camped there for 3 days. Now he says that there was a fast there, and this is a fast of 3 days. And then in verse 24, so I hope if you're not following this and you want me to slow down, just let me know. But in verse 24, something important happens. It says, "Then I separated 12 of the chief of the priests," and he lists these people, some of them, "and weighed unto them the silver, the gold, and the vessels, even the offering the house of our God, which the king and his counselors and his lords and all Israel there present had offered. I weighed unto their hand 650 talents of silver, silver of vessels 100 talents, and gold also 100 talents. So he has all this gold and silver, and he divides it. And he does this at the beginning of this 3-day period, right? So he sends some people away to get Levites, and then he divides the gold among these priests. And then verse 31, "Then we departed from the river of Ahava unto the 12th day of the first month," or on the 12th day of the first month, to go unto Jerusalem, and the hand of our God was upon us, and he delivered us from the hand of the enemy and of such as lay in wait by the way. So when did they leave the river Ahava? Okay, so we're going to put it in here. It's not... So it's which day? 12th day of the first month. And how long were they there?
3 days.
So there's 3 days, and at the beginning of this 3 days, they divided the silver and the gold, or the gold and the silver, however you want to put it. So they have this period of dividing the gold and silver, then they wait for 3 days, and they leave on the 12th day of the first month. And it says in verse 33, now on the 4th day, verse 32, and we came to Jerusalem and abode there 3 days. So they get to Jerusalem, which day? It doesn't say in that verse, but which day did they get there?
On the first day of the
First day of the 5th month. And how long did they wait there?
3 days.
So again, there's 3-day period that's mentioned. And then it says on the 4th day, in verse 33, was the silver and gold and the vessels weighed in the house of our God by the hand of Meremoth. So they actually bring this silver and gold to this temple after 3 days, right? So gold and silver. Does that make sense? Now, what do you notice about this if you're just looking at what I've drawn there? Okay. So what is this describing? What do you see happening? How would you describe this? Just, you put it on a line, you put these 3 days, the gold and the silver, and what would you think when you see this? Okay. What if I took a mirror and I put it on one side of there, like in the middle, and I did a reflection? What would we get? What's that? Well, we'd have a chiasm or a mirror, right? So, we'd have a mirror. This mirrors each other. And so, when we look at mirrors, chronological mirrors, what do we look for in that mirror? What does it mean if we have a mirror?
Something in the middle.
Okay, you have something in the middle, right? So that means here in the middle of this, there's something. So let's count this. Now, some of you have done the work on counting these dates. So this would be... If we're going to count, how many days is it from the 12th day of the first month to the first day of the 5th month? I guess is the best question to ask.
118.
Okay, so how do you do that? How are you counting it?
The day, not the day, the next day. Starting on the day, the first day of the first month.
Okay, but we're going to count from the 12th day of the first month.
I
Okay.
So you meant from the 12th.
From the 12th, because that's where our mirror begins. So those are the dates that are given us in the Bible. It doesn't tell us what the date is when the 3 days begin, and it doesn't technically really tell us when the 4th day is, though I'd assume it's the 4th day of the 5th month.
105 or 106.
Okay, so how are you counting that? So how many days is there in the 2nd month?
29.
And how many days in the 3rd month?
30.
And in the 4th month?
29.
So the 29, the 30 and the 29, how many days is that?
60.
So 68. And then
70, 88.
88, right? And then okay, so we have, I have to think about it myself again. So we have 88 days, and then how many days from the 12th day of the first month to the end of that month, how many days would you count there?
18,
Okay, why are you counting 18?
because it's 30.
Okay. But you're taking 12 off of that. Why wouldn't you count the 12th day as one? I'm just asking. And do we count?
If you counted the 12th day as part of it, that would be 31 days instead of... Because you get 12 and 18, so that's 30.
Yeah, so you go 19. Because you have 11 days. The 12th day is if 12th is the first one. I'm just saying, I'm asking the question. Because how we count
Right.
is important.
Right.
So, you know, we could just, normally we just say, oh, there's 30, you take off 12 from 30, you have 18 days left over. We had 88. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just asking why. You know, why would we do it that way? Are we going to count that day or are we not going to count it? That is, are we including that day as part of our count, or are we just counting from the middle of that day to the middle of the first day of the first month, all the way through, or do we count that day? And that's what you have to decide to do. I mean,
To find the center, you have to count that day.
yeah, if that's the way we would think of it, we might have to count that day if we want to find the center. And so how we count it is important. Now, when we count the first day of the fifth month, do we count that day as well, right? So there's different ways you could count this. You could count it as 30, that would be 19 plus 29 plus 30 plus 29 plus 1. So how much would that add up to?
Say it again.
You'd have 19 plus 29 plus 30 plus 29 plus 1.
Go again, please.
You would have 19
Mm-hmm.
plus 29
Mm-hmm.
plus 30 plus 29 plus 1 if you're going to count the first day of the fifth month.
108.
Yeah, so that could be 108. And I want to point this out because I normally count it as 107. And the reason why I do that is sometimes you have to decide how you're going to describe that period of time. Am I going to include the first day or not? But if I go from sometime within the 12th day of the first month, to sometime within the first day of the fifth month, it would be 107 days. But if I'm counting the days, the complete day, and the next, and that is a complete day, then it would be 108. And these are problems we run into that people could criticize us for when we count this. Now, if I counted it as 108, how many days would I divide it into? 54. So if I counted, including the 12th day of the first month, as 54 days between here and here, and I'm just going to move this, well, I'll keep it here. It's kind of small, but okay, so we said this was 108, and we said this is 54 from here to here.
100.
What's that? 108. And we would find that this would lead us to the 6th day of the third month. And what is the 6th day of the third month?
Pentecost.
So this is Pentecost, right? Not everybody knows that, but we should. That this is the 50th day from which day in the Jewish calendar? Which date do we count that from?
Day after Passover.
So the day after the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the 15th. And what is that day? It's the 16th. And what are they counting from?
First fruits.
From first fruits. And we find this in the Desire of Ages, that they always count 50 days. And the 50th day is this day, the 6th day of the third month. So the 16th day of the first month is then how many days from here? If I go to the 16th day, that's how many days to here? 50, right? So if I go to the 15th, how many days is that?
You go to the
So I'm going backwards. So in the 16th to here was 50. If I go to the 15th, how many is it? 51. And if I go to the 14th,
2,
52, and I go to the 13th,
53,
and I go to the 12th,
54.
54. So we're going to say that's 54 days. Now, from here to here, then we said it was 54 days. Right?
Mhm.
But when I count, so we're counting it that way, but when I would normally count from here to here, I'd count it as 107. And the reason I would do that is I'm counting it a little bit different when I do this count than I am when I'm counting backwards here. So there's actually 108 days in here if I include this first day of the count and the last day of the count. But normally we don't count a span that way. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that's just how I've always counted it. Now somebody could argue against me counting it that way, but that's just the way I prefer to count it, because that's the way I usually count days. Okay, so we have this date, and we have a chiasm. Now what is Pentecost in the time of Christ? How would this connect the 70 weeks with 31 AD, or the 70 weeks? How would this connect the 70 weeks with 457? What is Pentecost?
Outpouring the Spirit.
Okay, it's the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And I don't have the quote handy here, but Ellen White says that when the Holy Spirit was poured out on the day of Pentecost, what was Christ doing in heaven? He was inaugurating his work in the holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. But even if we didn't have Ellen White's quote, we would know that Pentecost in the time of Christ was poured out. That's the day that the Holy Spirit was poured out, was on the day of Pentecost. We would know that. And so we could say, well, the fact that Pentecost is in the middle of this chiasm would connect this event, this journey from Babylon to Jerusalem, it would connect it with the work of Christ.
Which is also a chiasm.
Yes, which is also a chiasm. Okay, so we know the work of Christ falls in the midst of a week, and that week is divided into half, and we're going to study that chiasm. So we have this connected to something that Christ has done, and that the fact that it marks the day of Pentecost is very significant.
So for us, be 2014.
Okay, well, we're going to deal with that later on. Okay, now we still haven't dealt with the to build. So now when Ezra gets to Jerusalem, what does he do? If you read in Ezra chapter 9, which we're not going to read, but if anybody knows, what does he do in chapter 9? So he gets there, he's delivered the gold and silver. Does anybody know what he does in Jerusalem?
He starts doing,
What's that? Okay, Olivine?
he starts separating the people from their strange wives.
Okay, he doesn't do that yet. So when he gets there, he basically just starts observing.
He goes around in the middle of the night.
Right.
Mm.
He goes around, well, you're thinking of Nehemiah. Yeah, so Nehemiah does the work of going at nighttime and looking at the walls. Here, he's observing the people, and what does he notice, Olivine, you were talking about? What does he
Their
notice?
Children can speak better of the other languages than they can of the Hebrew language.
Right. So what's happened? Why is that? What's happened to these people who were in Babylon, who have now come from Babylon and gone to Jerusalem?
Apostate.
They married women of Babylon, and now they have children and families, and they're coming back to Jerusalem, but they're not really going to be Jews. They're going to be part Jewish and part Babylonian. And this was a problem that they had before. So he makes a decision, and we find this in chapter 10. So we'll find one is that he recognizes this problem, and he looks for a solution, and this is going to be, where is the verse here?
Verse.
Verse 6, And Ezra rose up from before the house of God and went into the chamber of Johanan the son of Eliashib. And when he came thither, he did eat no bread, nor drink water, for he mourned because of the transgression of them that had been carried away. So the ones that had been in captivity, he was mourning because of their sins of marrying these foreign women. And they made proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem unto all the children of the captivity, that they should gather themselves together unto Jerusalem, that whosoever would not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes and the elders, and all his substance should be forfeited, and himself be separated from the congregation of those that had been carried away. So, in order to understand this correctly, one is we know that there's a period of 3 days that's going to happen. But what is the penalty if they don't show up to meet in Jerusalem within 3 days? What's going to happen to them?
Their goods will be confiscated.
So they could have their goods confiscated, and they could also be banished, right? They could be separated. What authority does Ezra have to do this? Where did he get this authority?
The decree.
So if you go back to Ezra chapter 7 and you read in the decree, verse 24 to 26, you find that this is given to Ezra. Well, look, verse 25. And thou, Ezra, after the wisdom of thy God that is in thine hand, set magistrates and judges which may judge all the people that are beyond the river, all such as know the laws of thy God, and teach ye them that know them not. And whosoever will not do the law of thy God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily upon him. And here's the things that they can do, whether unto death, or to banishment, or to confiscation of goods, or to imprisonment. So they have 4 things that they are allowed to do. And so what does that mean in Ezra chapter 10 when he issues this proclamation? What has he done? What does it show? What is shown that he has accomplished in order for him to do this? What has happened from the time that he's arrived in Jerusalem to this time? So the decree has gone into effect, right? So, and this is probably the first time that he's initiating this decree, right? So somewhere along the way, he set up magistrates and judges, but now for the first time, he's issuing a proclamation based upon this authority that's been given him by Artaxerxes in this decree that was given earlier. Okay, would you agree with that? Does anybody have problems with that? Okay, so if we go on and read, it says in verse 8, and that whosoever would not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes, this is where it says that they should be, their substance forfeited, or they're separated from the congregation. And then in verse 9 it says, Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered themselves together unto Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the street of the house of God, trembling because of this matter, and for the great rain. So, when they get there on the 20th day of the 9th month, what's happening? It's raining, right? And that's because this is the rainy season. You see this also in Nehemiah, when they talk about they're in Kislev, in the month Kislev. It's raining, right? This is when they get all their rain. So on the 20th day of the 9th month is the next date that's given us. So the 20th day of the 9th month. And this is after 3 days. So what do we notice here? What's that?
There's a pattern.
Yeah, there's a pattern. We have these 3 days. And would we recognize this again as a chiasm? So let's just look at this in a simpler way instead of counting 29 and 30 days for the months. How many days would it be from the first day of the 5th month to the 20th day of the 9th month? So just 30 days in a month. Let's just go 30 days in a month. So if you go from the 5th month the 6th month, the 7th month, the 8th month, that's how many months?
120.
4 months with how many days? It's 30, that's 120. And then how many more days would there be to the 20th day of the 9th month?
19.
We're just going to do it the simple way, 20. So how many days would that be?
140.
Okay. So this would then be, just in a simple way of doing it, this is 140 days. And if we cut 140 days in half, how many days would we have to have on each
70.
side? 70, right? So we now have 70. And so somewhere in between here and here is the center of this. So what date would that be if we went from here 2 months and 10 days from the first day of the 5th month? That would bring us to what date?
10th of the 7th month.
10th day of the 7th month. So here we have in the center of this chiasm the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, right? And the fact that we have this chiasm that points to the 10th day of the 7th month gives us a starting point for the 2300 days. That is, we know that it's the going forth of the commandment for the return of the people and to build. And it would be this to build, the center of this, would mark the commencement of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days. Now, some people might say I'm just leaping, doing leaps of logic to already know the conclusion. Yes, Larry?
Now, did they actually honor that day?
No. So, when we look in history, why did they not? They had the temple built 59 years before. Why are they not observing the Day of Atonement in 457?
Actually hasn't been rebuilt.
No ark.
The temple's rebuilt. Everything's there. What don't they have in the temple?
Ark.
The ark, right? So there's no Ark of the Covenant. That means they can't have a Day of Atonement. The high priest can't go in there and cleanse the sanctuary. We find this in the book of Nehemiah, where they are mourning over the fact that they can't have a Day of Atonement, but they decide to keep a Feast of Tabernacles. So one of the things that's interesting when you look at this restoration that happens with literal Israel after the Babylonian captivity is it's not a complete restoration. And the part that's not complete is the part of the sanctuary that's needed to have the Day of Atonement. So this gives more insight into why the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary has to occur, not the cleansing of the earthly sanctuary. Right? The earthly sanctuary can't be cleansed anymore. And the 2300 days points us to the cleansing of the sanctuary, but it's in heaven. So for the Jew here, the fact that there's no cleansing on the earthly sanctuary, they might be hoping someday to get the ark back. I'm not sure what they're thinking. But God has put the cleansing of the sanctuary off 2300 years from this date. So there can be nothing on the Day of Atonement specifically that's recorded as an event. But it's the center of a chiasm. And that center of the chiasm then has to mark the starting point. Does anybody have problems with that idea? I mean, we're Seventh-day Adventists and, we can understand it. But could you see any problems? Yeah, James.
I don't have any problems, but I have another question after everybody answers your question.
Okay, well, you just asked your question. I think everybody's answered it.
So I thought, a random thought, errant thought came to my mind right now. The Jews right now, the temple people, have everything ready to rebuild the temple if they can get rid of the dome of the rock.
Yeah.
Do they have an ark rebuilt right now?
But even if they did...
No, I know. But
I don't
I'm just
know.
Curious.
I don't know.
Because that's one thing I haven't heard about. Because if they didn't build an ark back then, why would they build an ark now? And with that, if they don't build an ark now, why would they build all of the other furniture? Because there wasn't nothing special about the ark itself. God didn't touch it or anything. So why didn't they build an ark and put it in there?
Yeah, it's a good question that they didn't do that.
Remember that
Ron Wyatt, who supposedly found the ark.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Ron Wyatt thinks he's found it. But it's in its hiding place. God will take it from its hiding place when it's the time, and people will be able to see those original 10 commandments and be judged by them. So, the ark was hidden. We don't know where it is, but God is going to take it from its hiding place. I don't believe Ron Wyatt actually found it. But this is an interesting structure. So, you know, and I like the 70 and 70 because we had that in the first two 7 times, 70 years and 70 years. We also have it in Leah and Rachel and plenty and famine, the years of plenty and famine, back-to-back 70s. And, you know, we could probably even argue just, you know, not counting the actual days for those periods. You know, for the first one as well, we could just, you know, go 55, 55, and 110, or however you want to look at it. Now, in counting it out in actuality, you can count it different ways. But for now, we're just going to leave it like this, and we can see that we have these 2 chiasms. Now, we know that we also have a chiasm in 1844, right? So this chiasm in 1844, does anybody want to just quickly tell us what it is? So this is 457. Here we're going to go 1844. So we're going to go the 10th day of the 7th month. We write these dates in here. We got the first day of the 1st month. And we have the first day of the 5th month here. So we have a chiasm here. Where do we place a chiasm in this history? Where do we count from? Okay, we remember that Samuel Snow, it's in your notes, when he was at Boston, midway between the time when they expected Christ to return to the date that they were now setting, which was the 10th day of the 7th month, he gave a presentation at the Tabernacle in Boston. Does anybody know what he said? It's on starts on page 21 of your notes. Well, let's just read it here. I like reading this. So here he is in Boston, and he says to the audience, "Where are we in our Advent experience?" The answer from the audience is in the tarrying time. So the tarrying time then is from the first day of the 1st month that it begins, right? And how long was the vision to tarry? It says until midnight. What is a day in prophecy? The answer is a year. Then what would a night be? 6 months. So what he's saying, they're tarrying, and they're tarrying for a year. A year is one. A day is 1 year, and so a night would be 6 months. So he's saying we're here. What's happening here then in his view? The first day of the 1st month is what? He would call this sunset. You know, don't worry about it. But this would be sunset, right? So he's taking this as sunset, and that this is going to be the nighttime, right? And then he says, so a night would be 6 months. So he's going to start from the first day of the 1st month, and he's going to count 6 months. And then what would midnight be? How long would it be to midnight? And they answer 3 months. And he asks, how long have we been in the tarrying time? And the answer is just 3 months. Then it is just the midnight now, he says, and I'm here with the midnight cry. In a few sentences, he explained that it was the fall of 457 that the decree went forth, and so they were short 6 months in their reckoning, showing them that the 2300 days would terminate October 22, 1844, instead of the spring, as they had previously supposed. Then in a strong voice he said, "Behold, the bridegroom cometh on the 10th day of the 7th month, October 22, 1844, go ye out to meet him." Now, there's some problems with this account. One is this is Loughborough's account, which he wasn't there, and he heard it from, I believe, Joseph Bates, who was there. I think it says here in my notes. Yeah, but I just can't remember who he heard it from. Yeah. Anyway, he places it at Exeter. And what would be the problem with placing this statement at Exeter on August 15th? How many months would they have been in the tarrying time in August 15th? 4 months, right? So this had to have been what occurred at Boston, because Boston is midway. But it's interesting that the Millerites often made a mistake and looked at Exeter as midnight. They thought that was halfway, even though they could simply do the math and find that it wasn't. Okay, so here he is at Boston. Now, we know that it's on the 5th day of the 4th month. And this is July 21st. This is August 15th. This is October 22. And this is April 19th. So this is a chiasm from the 1st day of the 1st month to the 5th day of the 4th month, and then from the 5th day of the 4th month to the 10th day of the 7th month. And there's different ways to count this out. If we count it, the whole period, it's 187 days. If we're counting this as one and this date as well. Otherwise, it'd be 186 days. So we usually say it's 187 days. So, I'm doing something different than down at the bottom. But we'll deal with this later on, why I'm doing this. So it's 187 days. And again, we have a chiasm. And this chiasm, we're going to look at another chiasm later on, a bit more in detail, with Samuel Snow's letters, and try to understand how this relates to what's happening here. And I'm trying to simplify this from how I've usually presented this. So usually I presented a lot more detail. I'm trying to go slower and give it time to sink in. So what do we see happening in 457? How would you describe this? If you were a Seventh-day Adventist who doesn't know anything about this message, and you saw these chiasms, how do you think you would respond to them? If you're open to the Holy Spirit and you're not resistant. Okay, somebody says, wow. But more, I'm thinking more intellectually. Right?
It would have to sink in your mind intellectually for you to have that wow experience.
Okay.
But you would see the truthfulness of it.
Okay, you would see the truthfulness of it. It would be really hard for a Seventh-day Adventist to look at this and just say, this is just chance, it doesn't mean anything. Because for a Seventh-day Adventist, we know that the Day of Atonement is important. We know that Pentecost is important. And we know that for the 2,300 days, that's marking the Day of Atonement at the end of a period. And then for this Pentecost, this is tied up with the 70 weeks, the middle of Christ's week. And so then we would have to say, well, there's got to be significance that this chiasm exists. Now, then if we show them the chiasm and the connection here, so we could say, they left Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month, and we show them that the first disappointment's on the 1st day of the 1st month in 1844. And then we show them that on August 15th we have Exeter, and that this aligns with their arrival in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month. This should connect with them. They could now say, well, this is very significant. Now, we'd have to know how to show this. Not all of us know how to show that it's August 15th. Because if you look at, it was on the Wednesday evening that Samuel Snow rode up on the horse, and his sister then tells Joseph Bates, there's a brother here who has some light on the subject. Joseph Bates was doing this presentation on a ship coming to harbor and how, it takes a long time. So, why is Christ delayed? And when you see, there's a video out on the Midnight Cry that some of the Adventist Church put out. They hired professional actors and so forth. And if you see this scene at Exeter, there's just some people standing in the woods, But there's like 5,000 people here at this camp meeting in Exeter. It would have been a pretty amazing thing. And it's at this point that these people go out and start spreading this message. So Adventists know about Exeter, at least they should. So you would probably have to prepare them if they don't know a lot about some of this history to show them that. But now you show them this chiasm pointing to Boston on July 21st. What should this tell them? What should Adventists who see this, what should they be thinking about this Millerite history and these chiasms? And what, if they're open to truth, what should they be thinking? Besides wow and things like that.
should join this message.
Yeah, they should think, I need to look into Millerite history and understand it better, that there's something there that we've been missing. And this is a very powerful way to present this message to people by presenting the 2,300 days and the 70 weeks. And you can build it into a much longer series of studies dealing with the 70 weeks and the 2,300 days. So, I mean, if you know some Adventists who are open to Bible studies, instead of starting out with, the 2520 or Trump, though you might want to eventually get there, you can introduce things like this that hardly any Adventist could argue against. Now, maybe some who are liberal, who don't accept the 2,300 days and so forth, you might think there would be resistance, and there might be, because they might not be open to truth. But many have rejected them because haven't seen any good arguments. And I would think if you present arguments like this, for some people even who maybe doubt the 2,300 days, they might take a second look at it. And if they can gain their faith once again in the 2,300 days, then they might gain their faith once again in God's Word and in spirit of prophecy and in Adventism. So that would be the hope that we would have. But the fact is we have now 3 chiasms, and we're going to look, not in the next one, but in the one after that, we're going to deal with Samuel Snow's letters, and we're going to try to understand the 4th chiasm, which comes from his letters. So there's a whole bunch of significance. But the thing is, the chiasm in Samuel Snow's letters isn't just something that's just pulled out of a hat, It already has this foundation that's been laid. Yes, James?
So on page 24, are you going to fill in what the marks are past Day of Atonement? You have a chiasm there, but you don't have it filled in. On page 24.
24, I have a chiasm. Yeah, okay, that's just the chiasm of, that's the midnight one, and yeah, the 120 days, I'm not dealing with that. The reason why I put the one of 120 days, so if you look on the top of page 24, that's where I'm just presenting the 2nd chiasm in 457. And the reason why I put the 120 days and the 70 days, does anybody know why, who's been in this message for a while? What the 120 and the 70 are?
Yes, priests and Levites.
So it's, okay, can you speak up, Olivine, and explain it to us? So on page 24, instead of having this chiasm here, I just have from the first day of the first month to the first day of the 5th month, 120 days. Right? Now, it's not actually 120 days, it's 117 if you literally counted the days. But it becomes a symbol. So what's the symbol of 120 days from the first day of the first month? Do you know this quite well? What this...
The 120 is a symbol of a shut door.
Okay.
And also, we make it a symbol for the priests using the tent, and the 70, the symbol of the Levites.
Okay, so what I'm familiar with is the 120 symbolizes the priests, and the 70 symbolizes the Levites. And why is that? Why do we use these? Larry should know. The 120 and the 70.
You use Ezra, where when Ezra gathered the people, he didn't see the Levites.
Yeah.
As well as in the time of Christ, you use 120 as an application for the 12 disciples being the priests, that walked with Christ in 9/11, even though it was 27 AD. And the 70 that he also set aside that had to go in pairs. So to kind of distinguish the 2 groups in Adventism for our time.
Okay, so we use to distinguish these 2 groups, the priests and the Levites in Adventism. We go to disciples, which have 12 and 70. And there's a lot more to it. But the idea is that we had 120 as a symbol. And so when you have this 70 here, we already established this 70. We just never noticed this 70 before, that it points to the 10th day of the 7th month as the center of a chiasm. So that's why I put that diagram there. Now, there's a whole bunch more things that we're going to look at regarding these chiasms. Now, I also have done a series of studies which I'm working on. I may present it sometime, called The Two Sticks. I've never presented it anywhere. And I go through all of the chiasms, right from Abraham's covenant all the way to the end, you know, the 25-20s and so forth. So these chiasms, one of the arguments that people have against the 25-20 is there's no such thing as a chronological chiasm, but they're all through Scripture. And they start in the first one that everybody should know is the 430 years that's divided into periods of 215 years. So that chronological chiasm has been around for a long time. People just don't normally refer to it as a chronological chiasm or to a mirror, but there's another one in the story of Joseph. And there is more that actually exist, and more structure that exists in the 2300 days and the 25-20 when you put them together that we have never noticed, or very few people have noticed. And so we're going to spend some time dealing with that as well. So any questions on that? I went through it maybe a little slower than I have in the past, but it's still probably pretty fast for some people. Now, in looking at the other decrees, we brought up dates. Now, these dates here can become symbols as well. And so we're going to look at, obviously the first day of the 5th month is a symbol, and the first day of the 1st month is a symbol, and the 10th day of the 7th month. And we also had and when we get to Samuel Snow's letters, so this is the 3rd decree, we're going to see that there's dates from the 2nd decree that are going to be part of Samuel Snow's letters. And there's also more, like from the 1st decree, which I don't usually get into, in how that connects to 1844. But we have these connections between 457 BC and 1844, and we should be able to teach this to people, right? So I haven't seen anybody else ever present this, but people should be presenting this, because I think this is an extremely powerful tool. And I don't know, can you think of anyone personally that you know that if you showed them this, it might make a difference in them accepting this message? That they would have to take a second look at the message. You think there's somebody, if they could look at it, if they would look at it? I would hope so.
Unless they were just completely without reason. You know,
Yes.
You just can't throw something like this completely aside.
Right, they would have to be completely without reason. And I've run into those types of people. I've run into people that
There are.
when you show them something like this, they become really, really resistant. Now, I do want to show you just some other little thing that I'm not sure if it's important or not, but one of the things, when I look at the 54 and the 54 and the 107, now somebody can say I arbitrarily chose 107 rather than 108 days to count. But if I took this and did this, what am I doing here? I'm taking this 107 and I'm writing a D and an M there. Okay, I'm making this the 10th day of the 7th month as a symbol. So 107 can symbolize the 10th day of the 7th month. What about the 54?
54 months.
Right? So again, this can be a symbol of midnight. So in this history, we have the 5th day of the 4th month where he's declaring the 10th day of the 7th month. And it's built into this chiasm if we just count this in the way that we'd normally count days. And this has to be 54, not 53, because if this is the 50th from the 16th, this would be 54 days. So we can see that there's a structure here. Now this 187 days, we're going to find later in Samuel Snow's letters that this has significance and that we can tie it to a date as well. So this precedent here, this idea, I mean, somebody could dismiss it. I don't know if I would use it right away with everybody, But some people can be impressed by that. Some people just think it's numerology or something, right? But to me, this happens again and again, that we can take spans of time and turn them into dates or have significance in them. And somebody would say, well, how can we do that? You know, how can we take either dates on our calendar or dates on a Jewish calendar and do these things with them? But when we can do it consistently, then it would be a strong evidence that, you know, we're doing something, that God has put this in these things as a design to give us hints. And these would be applications. This would be, I mean, obviously 54 days is not the 5th day of the 4th month, and I'm not saying that that's midnight, but I'm saying it ties us with that history in 457 BC. It ties us with the midnight in 1844. And so if this didn't occur in 457 BC, we'd have a hard time explaining how Millerite history parallels this history. And so we'd have to say what happens in Nehemiah when he's counting on the calendar there, and at the 20th year of Artaxerxes doesn't change in Nisan to the 21st, that it's still the 20th, we'd have to then accept that that is a rational way of looking at it, that Ezra and Nehemiah were counting the years of Artaxerxes' reigns fall to fall, even if we can't explain why they did it. And there's some evidence that they may have counted the reign of foreign kings fall to fall in that period. But they don't always do it that way in the Bible. So, you know, that inconsistency in the Bible bothers some people. But you're dealing with sometimes hundreds of years apart. People have different practices on how they do things. So I hope that's helpful. I hope it's understandable. The next presentation in the midst of the week is going to be dealing with Christ's week and a whole bunch of things dealing with the 2520. So it's a little bit of a change of pace from the book of Ezra. It's not really the book of Ezra, but it's going to set us up for understanding Samuel Snow's letters a little better when we examine those. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the light that has come upon your word in some of the very basic things of Adventism. And we know, Lord, that all of us have struggled at different times in our walk with you, in knowing whether we have a sure word of prophecy. But we know, Lord, as we look at the prophecies in more detail with the light that comes from the 2520 and the foundation of Adventism, that this glorious light could have unfolded much sooner for Seventh-day Adventists. But we are thankful, Lord, that we're here at the end of the world and that you're revealing this light to us. We ask, Lord, that we can share this light with others, that we can seek opportunities to present this to Seventh-day Adventists or whoever will hear it, that they may know that the foundation of Seventh-day Adventism was laid correctly. We also ask, Lord, for ourselves, that as we study, that we can have this assurance based upon your word, that the path that we are on is the correct path. And we pray this, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.